For decades, the Soviet Union projected power and unity to the world, while hiding brutal crimes behind the Iron Curtain. Now, declassified documents reveal the shocking truth: mass executions, forced labor camps, and psychological torture carried out in silence. This is the untold story of Soviet war crimes the world was never meant to see. For decades, the Soviet Union operated as one of the most secretive regimes in modern history, wrapping its internal affairs behind the opaque barrier known as the Iron Curtain. While the world focused on the ideological confrontation between capitalism and communism during the Cold War, the Soviet state meticulously concealed the darker truths of its governance. Through heavy censorship, state-controlled media, and a powerful propaganda machine, the USSR crafted an image of a utopian workers' paradise. Behind the scenes, however, it was a state built on fear, oppression, and systematic violence. Many of the Soviet Union's war crimes, comparable in scale and horror to those committed by Nazi Germany, remained largely unexposed for decades due to strategic global alliances, Cold War politics, and the USSR's ability to suppress information. The West's reluctance to publicly condemn Soviet atrocities, especially during World War II and the early Cold War, stemmed from the need to preserve cooperation against Nazi Germany and later against perceived communist threats. As a result, much of the Soviet regime's brutality was either downplayed or dismissed. It was only after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that historians gained access to previously classified archives. These declassified documents, survivor testimonies, and KGB files began to unravel a history of mass repression, ethnic cleansing, and state-sponsored terror. Today, these revelations offer a sobering reassessment of the USSR's legacy and challenge long-held myths about its role in shaping the 20th century. At the heart of the Soviet Union's darkest chapters lies the era of Joseph Stalin, a man who ruled the USSR with an iron fist from the mid-1920s until his death in 1953. Stalin's vision of a powerful, ideologically pure communist state was enforced not through unity and progress, but through paranoia, purges, and ruthless violence. During the Great Terror, 1936-1938, Stalin orchestrated a wave of purges against anyone perceived as a threat to his regime. Through show trials, coerced confessions, and extrajudicial executions, hundreds of thousands of people, including political rivals, military generals, scientists, and peasants, were arrested and often executed without a fair trial. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, became infamous for their use of torture and psychological manipulation to produce false confessions, turning neighbors, friends, and even family members into informants. Among the most notorious of Stalin's war crimes was the Katyn massacre in 1940. In a secret directive, over 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, and professionals were systematically executed in the Katyn forest and other locations, an act long denied by the USSR and falsely attributed to Nazi Germany until the early 1990s. Additionally, Stalin's regime employed forced collectivization policies that devastated agricultural productivity and triggered widespread famine. The Holodomor in Ukraine, 1932-1933, resulted in the deaths of an estimated 3 to 7 million people, as grain was forcibly seized from starving peasants to feed the industrializing Soviet state. Many historians and governments now recognize this famine as a man-made genocide, orchestrated as punishment for Ukrainian resistance to Soviet control. Stalin also unleashed ethnic cleansing campaigns, forcibly deporting entire populations, such as the Crimean Tatars, Chechens, Volga Germans, and Kalmyks, to remote and often deadly regions of Central Asia and Siberia. These groups were collectively punished for alleged collaboration with Nazi forces during World War II, even though no individual evidence was ever presented. The trauma of these deportations, often carried out in freezing cattle cars without food or water, left entire communities shattered for generations. In short, Stalin's era was not merely marked by political repression. It institutionalized terror as a mechanism of governance, creating a culture of silence, obedience, and fear that would define Soviet life for decades. His legacy of cruelty is preserved not only in the historical record, but in the generational scars of millions who suffered under his rule. While the Soviet Union is often celebrated for its role in defeating Nazi Germany, history reveals a disturbing pattern of war crimes committed by Soviet forces during and after World War II, acts that were hidden or denied for decades. As the Red Army pushed westward in its liberation of Eastern Europe, it did not merely confront Nazi forces, it also inflicted terror upon civilian populations. In the final stages of the war, Soviet troops committed widespread mass rapes, looting, and violence, particularly during the occupation of Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. The rape of Berlin in 1945 became one of the most horrifying chapters, with estimates suggesting over 2 million German women were raped, many repeatedly, and some murdered afterward. These atrocities were dismissed by Soviet officials as acts of revenge for Nazi crimes in Russia, and they remained buried under the glorified narrative of Soviet heroism. Moreover, the Soviet-Nazi alliance before 1941, under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, is a frequently overlooked episode of betrayal and conquest. This non-aggression treaty between the USSR and Nazi Germany secretly included a protocol to divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. As a result, the Soviet Union invaded Eastern Poland in September 1939, just days after the Nazis took the West. Soviet forces deported hundreds of thousands of Poles to gulags in Siberia and executed thousands more, including the Katyn massacre victims. These coordinated invasions and occupations led to forced Sovietization, the dismantling of local institutions and mass arrests. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were also occupied and annexed into the USSR during this time, with tens of thousands of their citizens deported or executed. These actions show that Soviet expansionism mirrored many of the same imperialistic and oppressive behaviors of the regimes they claimed to oppose. After the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945, the Soviet Union wasted no time in transforming its wartime victories into political dominance across Eastern Europe. Stalin's goal was not simply military conquest, it was ideological colonization. Through a series of puppet regimes, sham elections, and violent purges, the USSR installed communist governments in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. These newly formed Eastern Bloc states quickly fell under the influence of the Kremlin, where Soviet-style totalitarianism became the norm. Those who opposed communist rule, ranging from former resistance fighters to Catholic clergy, were arrested, executed, or sent to labor camps. The most brutal expressions of Soviet repression came in response to popular uprisings against communist rule. In Hungary, 1956, a national revolt against Soviet control broke out as students and workers demanded democratic reforms and the withdrawal of Soviet troops. The response was swift and merciless. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, killing over 2,500 civilians and arresting thousands more. Prime Minister Imre Nagy was executed after a secret trial. A decade later, in Czechoslovakia, 1968, the peaceful reform movement known as the Prague Spring, led by Alexander Dubček, sought to create socialism with a human face. The Soviet Union responded with an invasion by Warsaw Pact forces, crushing the movement and reinstating hardline rule. These interventions were not isolated acts of foreign policy. They were part of a broader Soviet doctrine that rejected political pluralism and viewed any deviation from Moscow's ideology as a threat to be eliminated. The post-war period saw the creation of a deeply entrenched surveillance state across the Eastern Bloc, with organizations like the Stasi in East Germany and Securitate in Romania, following the KGB's model of oppression. This era revealed that Soviet foreign policy was not just about protecting socialism. It was about ensuring absolute obedience, enforced through fear, propaganda, and brute force. At the core of Soviet internal terror was the Gulag system, a vast network of forced labor camps that stretched across the frozen wilderness of Siberia and Central Asia. Established under Lenin and massively expanded under Stalin, the Gulag became the Soviet regime's most effective instrument of punishment and control. By the 1930s and 1940s, millions of Soviet citizens, peasants, intellectuals, religious leaders, political opponents, and entire ethnic groups were sentenced to hard labor, under often fabricated charges such as anti-Soviet agitation or sabotage. The arrests were typically carried out by the NKVD, and trials were either non-existent or mere formalities. Inmates of the gulags were forced to work in extreme conditions, logging forests, mining, constructing railways, and digging canals with primitive tools and inadequate food. The White Sea-Baltic Canal, a major project completed in 1933, cost the lives of tens of thousands of prisoners. Cold, starvation, disease, and brutal guards created death rates that rivaled or exceeded Nazi concentration camps during peacetime. The gulags were not only places of punishment, but a deliberate strategy to break human will and extract economic output from expendable labor. The scale of this system was staggering. By 1953, just before Stalin's death, over 2.5 million people were imprisoned in labor camps or special settlements. Many of the inmates were imprisoned for decades without trial, and their families were often deported or socially ostracized. Even after Stalin's death and Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin's crimes in 1956, the Gulag system persisted in various forms for decades. It left deep scars across generations of Soviet citizens and stood as one of the clearest manifestations of totalitarian cruelty masked behind the rhetoric of socialism. While physical repression was rampant in the Soviet Union, perhaps even more insidious was the regime's use of psychological torture and manipulation, particularly under the authority of the KGB, the Soviet Union's feared state security agency. Beyond surveillance and arrests, the KGB pioneered psychological warfare to crush dissent, silence opposition, and destroy the minds of those who resisted. Techniques ranged from sleep deprivation, solitary confinement, and fake executions to subtler forms like gaslighting, blackmail, and forced confessions under prolonged interrogation. One of the darkest practices was the abuse of psychiatry for political ends. From the 1960s onward, dissidents, whistleblowers, religious believers, and intellectuals were often diagnosed with fictitious mental illnesses, such as sluggish schizophrenia, a condition invented to justify the indefinite incarceration of otherwise healthy individuals in psychiatric hospitals. In these institutions, patients were drugged with heavy tranquilizers, isolated, and subjected to degrading treatments, all while labeled mentally ill by the state, thus discrediting their political messages without the need for a public trial. In parallel, the Soviet state mastered mass surveillance and intimidation tactics that extended into every corner of society. People were encouraged or coerced to inform on each other. Students reported teachers, children on parents, and friends on friends. Typewriters and copy machines were registered to prevent the spread of unauthorized literature, and personal correspondence was frequently intercepted. The goal was not just to punish dissent, but to create a culture of fear, where even private thoughts felt dangerous. This silent warfare was just as destructive as physical violence. It tore apart families, crushed movements before they began, and created a deeply paranoid population conditioned to self-censor and obey. The long-term psychological effects were profound: lingering trauma, distrust in institutions, and generational silence that only began to break after the Soviet Union's collapse. These strategies reveal that Soviet control was not only enforced through tanks and prisons, but also through the calculated manipulation of the human psyche. Despite the scale and brutality of Soviet war crimes, for much of the 20th century, the global community, particularly the Western powers, remained largely silent. This was not due to ignorance, but rather geopolitical necessity. During World War II, the Western Allies found themselves reluctantly allied with Joseph Stalin in the fight against Nazi Germany. Publicly exposing Soviet crimes, such as the Katyn massacre, would have fractured that alliance and undermined morale during the war effort. Even after the war, as the Cold War emerged, strategic containment of communism became the West's priority, often at the expense of full historical transparency. Take, for instance, the Katyn massacre, where the Soviet Union executed over 22,000 Polish officers and intelligentsia in 1940. When the Nazis discovered the mass graves in 1943 and exposed the massacre, the Soviets denied responsibility and blamed the Germans. Although British and American intelligence had evidence of Soviet guilt, both Churchill and Roosevelt suppressed the truth to avoid conflict with Stalin. The Katyn incident remained a forbidden topic in Soviet bloc countries for decades, and only in 1990 did the Soviet government formally admit its responsibility. This suppression was not an isolated case. Many survivors of gulags, deportations, and psychiatric abuse were silenced or discredited. Only with the defections of Soviet citizens, including Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who exposed the Gulag system through his groundbreaking book The Gulag Archipelago, did Western audiences begin to understand the scope of Soviet oppression. Even then, there was resistance among intellectuals and political circles to fully accept these truths, as many on the political left idealized the Soviet Union as a symbol of anti-fascism or worker solidarity. The consequences of this silence were enormous. Millions of victims remained forgotten, and the Soviet regime continued to operate without serious international accountability. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked a turning point in the uncovering of decades of state-sponsored crimes. As newly independent states emerged from the ruins of the USSR, Russia, Ukraine, the Baltics, and others, former KGB archives, Communist Party records, and classified files began to surface. For the first time, historians and journalists had access to concrete evidence of the horrors that had long been whispered about but denied. These included execution orders signed by Stalin himself, internal memos discussing mass deportations, and detailed reports of torture, surveillance, and systemic abuse. The opening of these archives exposed not just the crimes of Stalin, but also those of his successors. Files detailed how Khrushchev continued surveillance and repression despite his denouncement of Stalin, how Brezhnev's era saw the systematic use of psychiatric abuse against dissidents, and how the KGB maintained control through blackmail and fear well into the 1980s. In Eastern Bloc nations, similar documents confirmed the complicity of local communist parties in mass arrests, torture, and Soviet-directed crackdowns. In Russia, the process of confronting this history was uneven. While some leaders like Boris Yeltsin pushed for openness and reform in the early 1990s, the rise of Vladimir Putin, himself a former KGB officer, led to a retightening of state control over historical narratives. Archives were reclassified, NGOs documenting Soviet-era abuses were shut down, and state-sanctioned memory increasingly glorified Soviet achievements while minimizing its crimes. In modern Russia, Stalin's image has been partially rehabilitated, with many Russians now viewing him as a symbol of strength rather than tyranny. Still, the opening of archives sparked a wave of scholarship, memorials, and documentaries that continued to reshape our understanding of the 20th century. Countries like Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Georgia have built museums and memorials to honor victims of Soviet oppression. The declassified evidence forces the global community to confront the reality that the Soviet Union, while instrumental in defeating fascism, also committed some of the most horrific crimes of the modern era, crimes that can no longer be denied or ignored. The collapse of the Soviet Union did not erase the deep scars left behind by decades of terror, repression, and mass violence. In fact, the legacy of Soviet war crimes continues to shape not only the post-Soviet republics, but also global politics, international law, and modern authoritarian behavior. Countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic states have spent years trying to rebuild their national identities while confronting the painful remnants of Soviet occupation, memorializing victims, seeking justice, and removing communist symbols from public life. However, the reckoning with the Soviet past has been far from universal. In modern Russia, the approach to Soviet history has grown increasingly selective and politicized. Under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, the state has promoted a nationalist narrative that emphasizes Soviet triumphs, particularly the victory over Nazi Germany, while minimizing or outright denying the regime's atrocities. Stalin, once widely condemned even within Russia, has seen a resurgence in popularity, portrayed in some circles as a strong leader who made the USSR a global superpower. This rehabilitation has led to the suppression of organizations like Memorial, a Russian NGO dedicated to documenting the victims of Soviet repression, which was labeled a foreign agent and banned in 2021. Outside Russia, the global implications of the Soviet legacy are significant. The use of disinformation, psychological control, and surveillance pioneered by Soviet agencies like the KGB laid the groundwork for modern strategies of digital authoritarianism. Many governments around the world, especially those with authoritarian tendencies, have borrowed from the Soviet playbook to silence dissent, control information, and consolidate power. In this way, the Soviet model of repression continues to echo in the 21st century, demonstrating how unchecked power, left unpunished, can influence generations. The exposure of Soviet war crimes is not merely an academic exercise in revisiting history. It is a necessary act of moral accountability, one that serves as a warning for current and future generations. For too long, these crimes were overshadowed by ideological divides, political alliances, and the veil of Cold War secrecy. But the truth, once uncovered, demands recognition. The deliberate starvation of millions, the execution of political opponents, the deportation of entire ethnic groups, the torture of dissidents, and the psychological warfare against innocent civilians, these were not isolated actions. They were part of a systemic, state-sponsored policy of terror designed to control a population through fear and violence. Remembering these crimes is vital not only for the victims and their descendants, but also for the global community. As historical revisionism rises and authoritarianism spreads, the lessons of the Soviet era grow more urgent. Denying or minimizing these atrocities enables future tyrannies. A world that forgets the truth of the past is a world vulnerable to repeating it. By shedding light on these hidden crimes, we affirm the importance of truth, justice, and human dignity, and ensure that the millions who suffered under the Soviet regime are not forgotten. The declassified secrets of the USSR are not just about the past, they are a mirror to our present and a warning to our future.